The sun had not yet risen, but he was already awake. Not because someone called him, not because there was an alarm or a schedule written on paper. He woke because the soil demanded it, because the season didn't wait, because if he missed even 3 days of the planting window, his entire family would face a hungry winter. His name doesn't appear in any record. He wasn't a king, a priest, or a general. He was a farmer. And in the world Jesus walked through, in the dusty hills of Galilee, along the rocky terraces of Judea, farmers like him were everywhere. They were the majority, the quiet backbone of an entire civilization. We talk about Jesus healing the sick, walking on water, overturning tables in the temple, but we rarely stop to ask, what was the world actually like beneath his feet? What did the land smell like after rain? What did it cost a man to plant a field? What happened when the harvest failed? Because here's what most people miss. When Jesus told parables about sowers and seeds, about vineyards and workers hired at dawn, he wasn't reaching for metaphors from a distant world. He was describing the daily reality of almost everyone listening to him. These weren't illustrations, they were mirrors. And if you've ever read those parables and felt like something was just beyond your understanding, like there was a layer of meaning you couldn't quite touch, it's probably because we've lost something. We've lost the feel of first-century soil between our fingers. Stay with this, because what we're about to uncover changes the way those stories land entirely. Galilee in the 1st century was not a barren wasteland. That image, dry, empty, lifeless, is inaccurate. Ancient writers described it as extraordinarily fertile. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote that the soil was so rich and productive that even the laziest farmer could coax abundance from it. The region received reliable winter rains. The valleys retained moisture. The hillsides, though rocky, had been cultivated with terraces built over generations. But fertile does not mean easy. Farming in this era was an act of endurance. The average Galilean farmer worked land that belonged, in many cases, not fully to him. Roman taxation had reshaped land ownership across Judea and Galilee. Many small farmers were tenant farmers, working fields owned by wealthy landowners and giving up a portion of their harvest as rent. On top of that came Roman taxes, temple tithes, and local levies. Scholars estimate that a typical farming family in 1st century Judea surrendered somewhere between 30% and 50% of everything they grew. Think about that. Half of your harvest gone before your children ate a meal from it. This is the world Jesus moved through, not a world of comfortable abundance, a world of calculated survival, seasonal anxiety, and quiet, grinding labor. The farming year began in the autumn, specifically around October and November, when the first rains arrived. These were called the former rains, and Jewish farmers waited for them the way a sailor watches the horizon. Without that initial moisture, the soil, baked hard by summer, could not be plowed. It was like trying to break stone. The plow itself was a simple wooden instrument, often tipped with iron. It was pulled by oxen, though families who couldn't afford oxen used donkeys, or in desperate cases, pulled the plow themselves. The plow didn't dig deep by modern standards. It scratched the surface, turned the top layer, broke the crust. Then the farmer walked behind it, broadcasting seed by hand, reaching into a bag hung over his shoulder and scattering grain in wide arcs across the broken ground. This is exactly the image Jesus drew on in the parable of the sower, a man going out to plant, scattering seed onto different kinds of ground, some falling on the path where it was trampled, some on rocky soil, some among thorns, and some on good ground, producing a harvest. For the farmers listening to that parable, this wasn't poetry, it was last Tuesday. They knew exactly what rocky soil meant, the hidden limestone shelf just beneath the surface that looked like good earth until your plow hit it. They knew what thorns meant, the persistent wild plants that came back every season no matter how many times you cleared them. And they knew the quiet, almost desperate hope that came with scattering that seed. the hope that enough of it would land somewhere that gave it a chance. If you're finding this glimpse into the ancient world meaningful, the kind of historical depth that makes Scripture feel real and grounded, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below about which biblical parable you'd like to understand in its full historical context. There are layers to these stories most people never get to see, and every comment helps shape what we explore next. The primary crops of first-century Galilee and Judea were wheat and barley. Barley was the crop of the poor. It grew faster, tolerated poorer soil, and ripened earlier. Wheat was more valuable, more nutritious, and more demanding. A family that could grow wheat was doing reasonably well. A family surviving on barley was near the edge. Alongside grain, olives were central to everyday life in a way that's difficult to overstate. Olive oil was not simply a cooking ingredient. It was fuel for lamps. It was used in medicine, in religious ritual, in preserving food, in cleansing the skin. An olive grove was not a luxury. It was a form of long-term wealth, passed from father to son, carefully maintained across generations. Olive trees in this region could live for centuries. Some of the trees standing in the Garden of Gethsemane today are considered by botanists to be among the oldest living trees in the world. Gethsemane, in fact, means oil press. It was a working agricultural site, a place where olives were brought to be crushed and pressed. When Jesus went to pray there on the night of his arrest, he chose a working farm on the edge of the city. That detail is rarely noticed, but it carries weight. Vineyards were also deeply woven into the agricultural and spiritual fabric of the region. Grapes required years of patient labor before they produced anything. You planted a vineyard understanding that your children might benefit from it more than you would. You built walls around it to keep out animals. You constructed a watchtower so someone could stand guard during harvest season when the fruit was at its most vulnerable. Every element of the vineyard parables Jesus told was understood by his audience not as symbolism first, but as practical lived experience. Harvest came in the spring, wheat and barley in May and June, olives in October and November, grapes in late summer. Each harvest season was its own form of controlled chaos. Entire communities participated. Reapers bent low in the fields, cutting grain close to the ground with curved iron sickles. Gleaners, the poor, the widows, the foreigners, followed behind, collecting what was dropped or left at the edges of the field. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was Torah obligation. Leviticus 19 commanded farmers to leave the corners of their fields unharvested and not to go back for what was missed. The edges belonged to those who had nothing. Ruth in the Old Testament was a gleaner. Boaz, who owned the field, was following an agricultural law that treated the poor as having a legitimate claim on the harvest, not as recipients of generosity, but as holders of a right. By the time of Jesus, this practice was still observed, and in a world where taxation had squeezed small farmers to the edge, many of them were one bad harvest away from becoming gleaners themselves. After reaping, the grain was threshed on an open threshing floor, a flat, exposed surface on high ground where the wind could do its work. Sheaves were spread out and beaten, or oxen were walked over them to break the stalks. Then came winnowing, tossing the grain into the air with wooden forks so the wind carried away the chaff and the heavier grain fell back to the ground. John the Baptist used this exact image when describing the coming judgment, one who would gather the wheat into the barn and burn the chaff with unquenchable fire. His audience didn't need an explanation. They had stood on threshing floors. They understood exactly what happened to the chaff. What's remarkable and worth sitting with is how completely the agricultural world shaped the spiritual vocabulary of the entire New Testament era, not as decoration, not as metaphor layered on top of meaning. The farming world was the meaning. The soil, the seed, the vineyard, the harvest, the oil press, these weren't symbols chosen for their beauty. They were chosen because they were true, because they described things every person in that crowd had touched with their own hands. When Jesus said that a grain of wheat must fall into the earth and die before it can bear fruit, He wasn't reaching for dramatic language. He was observing something his listeners had watched every planting season, something they understood not just mentally, but in their muscles, in the ache of a morning spent bent over a field. The farmer who woke before sunrise, the man we imagined at the beginning of this, he likely never heard his name remembered by anyone. His harvest records weren't kept, his prayers weren't written down. But the world he shaped with his hands was the world that shaped the language of faith for 2,000 years. That might be worth thinking about. The parables aren't stories from a distant world, they're windows. And when you understand what it actually cost to plant a field in first-century Galilee, the taxation, the risk, the back-breaking labor, the hope placed into uncertain ground, the stories don't just become clearer, they become heavier,